started with a letter taped to my mailbox. Community dog park proposal, it said. Right on my fence line. I laughed. The HOA had voted on my land without telling me. Neighbors whispered I'd never win against Karen Voss. I just nodded and kept working my fields. Karen didn't notice the for sale signs going up around her. By the time she did, it was already too late. My name is Dale Whitaker, 44 years old, third generation on this dirt in rural Ohio. I run 60 acres of corn, hay, and a small herd of cattle my grandfather started in 1961. It's not a big operation, but it's mine, and it's paid for. My wife Carol teaches third grade in town, and our daughter Emma is finishing her first year of vet school 2 states over. Life out here is quiet. Early mornings, late nights, and a kind of peace you don't find behind a desk. That peace didn't last. 2 years ago, a developer bought the old Kessler property next door and built Meadow Ridge Estates, 40 houses on land that used to grow soybeans. I didn't mind neighbors. I minded what came with them. Within months, the HOA sent letters about my unsightly barn, visible from 3 backyards. I ignored them, since my barn sat on my land, built before their houses existed. The letters kept coming anyway, each one a little more official sounding than the last. Karen Voss became HOA president in the subdivision's first election, running unopposed because nobody else wanted the headache. She'd moved from a gated community outside Columbus, and she treated Meadow Ridge like her personal kingdom, right down to approved mailbox colors. I met her the day she walked onto my property uninvited, clipboard in hand, measuring the distance from my cattle fence to the Reynolds back porch. "This is a hazard," she said. I told her cows had been standing there since before her house had a foundation. She smiled the way people do when they've already decided you're wrong. "The board will be discussing agricultural nuisances at our next meeting," she said, tucking a business card into my hand like I should be grateful. I never called the number. Word spread fast in Meadow Ridge that the farmer next door was a problem. Some neighbors, like the Alvarez family, waved at me at the feed store and said they didn't agree with Karen. Others just avoided eye contact, unwilling to cross her. My cousin Pete, who sold real estate in the county, warned me Karen had a reputation 2 towns over. "She got a whole community garden shut down in Westfield," he said. "Made up code violations until the family who ran it just gave up and moved. I figured I had nothing she could touch. My deed was clean, recorded in 1961, decades before her subdivision was a blueprint. What I didn't know yet was that Karen wasn't interested in code violations anymore. She wanted my land itself. It happened at a town hall meeting about a proposed county greenway. Karen stood up and suggested, almost casually, that the underutilized pasture land bordering Meadow Ridge would make a wonderful community dog park. Better use of space than a few cows nobody needs. A few people chuckled, thinking she meant the county's own parcel down the road. She didn't correct them. Arms crossed, watching her point at a map with my North 40 circled in red marker like it was already hers to plan. After the meeting, I approached her. "That's my land you're circling," I said. She barely looked up, exploring community amenities. "Dale, nothing's decided." Her tone suggested otherwise, calm and certain, like she'd already run the numbers in her head. I went home and pulled my deed and survey out of the fireproof box in the closet. Everything was clean. No easements crossing that section. No shared access. Nothing giving Meadow Ridge any legal foothold on my North 40. I slept fine that night. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the HOA's attorney, citing an historic access easement along my northern fence line, supposedly granted to the original Kessler property in 1978. I'd never heard of it. Who'd farmed that ground his whole life? I called the county recorder's office. The clerk, a patient woman named Sandra, found nothing matching that easement in any indexed record. Might be an old handwritten filing, she said. Those sometimes get lost in the shuffle before digitization. That word, might, kept me up at night. Karen's letter proposed a community mediation session to discuss shared use of the disputed strip. I told Carol I wasn't mediating anything I hadn't agreed to in the first place. Carol, calmer than me, suggested we get a lawyer before Karen got any further ahead. We hired Ruth Bellamy, a land use attorney who'd handled boundary disputes for half the farms in the county. She read the HOA letter twice, frowned, and said the cited easement document number didn't match any filing format the county had used in 1978. Something was off. Ruth requested the original document from the HOA's attorney. What came back was a photocopy of a photocopy. Signatures faded. Notary stamp smudged beyond reading. This wouldn't hold up in a coffee shop argument, Ruth said, let alone a courtroom. Still, Karen kept pushing forward. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended uninvited, Karen presented the dog park idea to residents as a done deal pending final paperwork, complete with rendered images of a fenced play area, benches, and a water fountain sitting squarely on my North 40. Some residents applauded. Others, like retired schoolteacher Marion Doyle, asked pointed questions about ownership. Karen brushed her off with practiced ease. The details are being finalized with the property owner, she said, looking briefly at me like I was a formality, not a person. I stood up before she could move to the next slide. I never agreed to sell, lease, or share an inch of that land, I said. The room went quiet, but her knuckles went white around the edge of the podium. We can discuss the specifics privately, Dale, she said, trying to steer the room back on script. I didn't sit down. Public presentation with my land in it, I said. A few neighbors nodded, though most stayed carefully silent. Driving home that night, Carol asked what I thought Karen's angle was. I didn't have an answer yet, but something about the confidence in her voice, like she already owned the outcome, told me this wasn't just an overzealous HOA president chasing a pet project. The first real trouble came a week later. I found a section of my perimeter fence cut. 3 cows loose along the county road. No storm, no fallen tree, just clean wire cutters and tire tracks in the grass near the Meadow Ridge access road. I called the sheriff's office. Deputy Alan Ruiz took photos and a report but admitted, without cameras or witnesses, there wasn't much to go on. Could be kids, he said. I didn't think so. They're in 3 neat, deliberate places. 2 days after the fence incident, Karen sent a formal HOA notice citing repeated livestock containment failures as a safety concern to the neighborhood, attaching photos of my cattle on the road, taken, conveniently, on the exact day my fence had been cut. Ruth raised an eyebrow when I showed her the timeline. That's either an extraordinary coincidence, she said, or somebody wanted photos of loose cattle badly enough to make some. I didn't want to believe a woman running a homeowners association would cut my fence herself. Still, I started checking my property line every morning before chores, walking the fence with a thermos of coffee and my dog Scout trotting beside me. Nothing else happened that week, but I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked at the road's edge twice. At the following HOA meeting, Karen used the containment failures as leverage, arguing my unsafe farming practices justified the board revisiting the dog park proposal as a buffer zone for community safety. It was clever. Into her justification. Marian Doyle spoke up again, asking why the HOA hadn't simply asked the sheriff about the fence-cutting report before drawing conclusions. Karen said she wasn't aware of any investigation, though I'd mentioned it to 3 separate neighbors who lived 2 doors from her house. After the meeting, Marian pulled me aside in the parking lot. "I've seen this before with her," she whispered. "She did something similar to a family in Westfield before we moved here. Nobody could ever prove it was her, but everybody knew." I filed that away. Ruth suggested we install trail cameras along the fence line, both for evidence and peace of mind. I bought 3 from the farm supply store and mounted them where the cuts had happened, angled toward the access road that ran along Meadow Ridge's border. For 2 weeks, nothing. Then, late on a Tuesday night, a camera caught a figure in a dark jacket near the fence post, moving with the kind of care that suggested familiarity, not trespassing by accident. The face was turned away, but the gait looked familiar. I showed the footage to Deputy Ruiz. He agreed it was suspicious, but said the image quality wasn't enough to identify anyone conclusively. "Keep the cameras running," he said. "One clear frame changes everything." I nodded, though patience was wearing thinner every day. Around the same time, I noticed Karen's husband, Roy Voss, a county council member, had been unusually active in local zoning meetings, pushing an item called Rural Residential Transition Overlay that, buried in dense language, applied specifically to parcels bordering new developments like mine. Pete, still plugged into real estate gossip, told me the overlay would make it easier for developers, or HOAs acting on their behalf, to petition for partial land use changes on adjoining agricultural parcels for community benefit. My North 40 fit that description perfectly. I started to see the shape of it. Karen wasn't just an overbearing HOA president chasing a pet project anymore. She and Roy seemed to be building a legal and political path, piece by piece, toward taking a chunk of my farm whether I agreed or not. Carol didn't sleep well that week either. "They're rezoning around us," she said one night, staring at the ceiling. I told her I wasn't going to let some paperwork erase 60 years of my family's work. But even as I said it, I wasn't entirely sure how to stop it. Ruth began digging into the 1978 easement, more seriously, pulling old plat maps and county commission minutes from that year. She found a reference to a proposed access road for the Kessler farm that was discussed, but never approved, and certainly never granted to anyone. "If anything," Ruth said, "this actually strengthens your position. There's a paper trail showing the county explicitly rejected that easement 40-some years ago." Karen's claim wasn't just weak. It appeared to be built on a request the county had already denied. I wanted to bring that evidence straight to the HOA meeting, but Ruth advised patience. "Let her keep building her case in public," she said. The more she commits to this story, the harder she falls when we show the record says otherwise. I trusted her instinct. The dog park proposal appeared on the county's public agenda as an informational item a month later, meaning Karen had gone over my head to try to get preliminary county support before the HOA vote even happened. It felt like she was racing a clock only she could see. At the county meeting, Karen presented cheerful renderings again, describing community goodwill and responsible land stewardship, never once mentioning that the landowner in question had publicly refused. A commissioner asked directly if the property owner had been consulted.
Karen said discussion.
I stood up from the audience. There are no ongoing discussions, I said. I have refused this proposal in writing, verbally, and now in front of this board. The commissioners exchanged glances. One asked Karen to clarify the legal basis for the presentation at all. Karen mentioned the 1978 easement. I asked, calmly, if the county had a copy of that recorded document, since mine showed no such filing existed. The room went quiet, still verifying the exact filing details, which was a polite way of saying she had nothing. The commission tabled the item pending documentation, a small but real win. Driving home, Carol squeezed my hand. That's the first time I've seen her flinch, she said. I wanted to feel triumphant, but something told me Karen wasn't the type to simply walk away. Sure enough, within days, a certified letter arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize, claiming to represent Meadow Ridge community interests, threatening a nuisance lawsuit over ongoing agricultural hazards unless I agreed to a voluntary conservation easement over the disputed acreage. Ruth read it and shook her head. This is intimidation dressed up as legal language, she said. There's no real cause of action here. Still, the letter rattled me. Lawsuits cost money and time, even ones without merit. And Karen clearly had more resources than I did. I asked Pete quietly if he knew who was funding this. He made a few calls and came back with an answer that surprised me. The law firm's retainer had been paid not by the HOA's dues account, but by a shell company registered to Roy Voss. That detail didn't make sense to Ruth right away. Why would a county councilman personally fund a lawsuit against a farmer over a dog park? She asked. Neither of us had an answer yet, but it confirmed this was about more than Karen's pride in a project. I decided to look into Roy Voss myself, starting with public records on his business filings. He owned a development consulting firm, Voss Land Partners, registered the same year Meadow Ridge Estates broke ground. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't like. Voss Land Partners had consulted on 3 other subdivisions in the county, each one bordering agricultural land that, within 2 years of development, saw the neighboring farmland rezoned or sold under pressure. My North 40 wasn't the first target. It was a pattern. Marion Doyle, when I mentioned this, wasn't surprised. Karen, always seems to end up president of these HOAs right when land near them gets complicated, she said. I always figured it was coincidence. Guess I should have trusted my gut sooner. Ruth suggested we request public records on any communications between Karen, as HOA president, and Roy's consulting firm, since Ohio's open meetings laws sometimes extended surprisingly far when public infrastructure or zoning was involved. It was a long shot, but worth trying. While we waited on records requests, Karen escalated the pressure at home. Delivery trucks started showing up at odd hours claiming scheduled deliveries. I hadn't ordered, tying up my driveway during morning chores. Small, deniable annoyances designed to wear a person down day by day. One morning, I found a sign staked into my own field, 20 feet past my fence line, reading future site, Meadow Ridge Community Dog Park, complete with the HOA's logo. Whoever placed it hadn't just trespassed. They'd done it with total confidence nobody would stop them. I called Deputy Ruiz again, and this time, combined with the trail camera footage and the sign, he agreed there was enough for a formal trespassing complaint against persons associated with the Meadow Ridge HOA, since the sign itself was traceable to their print vendor. Karen denied any knowledge of the sign when questioned, claiming an overeager volunteer must have acted without authorization. The vendor's invoice, however, listed Karen's personal email as the order contact. Deputy Ruiz noted the discrepancy in his report, though no charges followed yet. Ruth said these small inconsistencies mattered more than they seemed. Juries and judges remember patterns, she said, even when individual incidents seem minor. Right now, we're building a record that shows exactly who's been dishonest from the start. I held onto that thought like a rope. The HOA's next general meeting turned into something closer to a trial than a homeowners gathering. Neighbors who'd once stayed quiet started asking why the board had spent association funds on a legal threat against a farmer with no proven wrongdoing. Karen looked rattled for the first time. "We are simply protecting community interests," she said, her voice tighter than usual. Someone in the back, an older man named Frank Ostrowski, asked bluntly, "Whose interests, Karen? Because it sounds a lot like your husband's business. Not our dues money." A few people laughed nervously. Karen adjourned the meeting early, citing time constraints, though the agenda clearly listed another 30 minutes scheduled. Walking out, I caught her staring at me from across the parking lot, her expression somewhere between fury and calculation. It wasn't the look of someone giving up. That night, I told Carol everything Pete and Ruth had uncovered. The shell company, the pattern of rezoned farmland, the sign, the fence. She listened quietly, then said something that stuck with me. She's not fighting for a dog park anymore. She's fighting not to lose. Carol's words turned out to be more accurate than either of us knew. The next week, Ruth received a response to our records request showing emails between Karen and Roy discussing acquisition timelines for parcels along the Meadow Ridge border, dated months before the dog park was ever proposed. One email, in particular, stood out. Karen had written to Roy that the dog park framing would be an easier sell to the board and county than an outright rezoning request. In other words, the dog park was never really about dogs. It was cover. Ruth explained the strategy plainly. Land held for agricultural use gets tax breaks and zoning protection, she said. But community amenity land near a subdivision can be reclassified more easily. And once reclassified, it's a lot easier to eventually develop or sell at profit. Clicked into place. Likely planned to eventually acquire the reclassified strip, develop it, or flip it to another builder, using the goodwill of a community dog park to grease the zoning process while quietly building equity in land that wasn't even his yet. I felt something shift in me. Less fear now. More resolve. This wasn't a woman who simply disliked my barn's view. This was a calculated, years-long strategy using her position of trust to manipulate neighbors and process alike, all funneling toward her husband's business ledger. Ruth cautioned me against confronting Karen directly with the emails yet. "We use this at the right moment," she said. "In front of the people who can actually stop it. Not in a shouting match on your porch." I agreed, though patience had never been harder. Around this time, my cousin Pete mentioned something almost in passing that would matter more than either of us realized. 2 neighboring farms, the Hendricks place to the west and the old Callahan tract to the north, were both quietly listed for sale by retiring owners. Both parcels bordered the same county access road Meadow Ridge relied on for a secondary entrance, and both wrapped partially around my property. At the time, I filed the information away as interesting, not yet realizing how directly it would end up shaping everything ahead. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down publicly, launching a petition drive within Meadow Ridge demanding the county prioritize community green space near the subdivision. She framed it as pure civic spirit, gathering nearly 100 signatures from residents who had no idea about the emails Ruth had uncovered. I started attending every county zoning session I could, sometimes just to watch, sometimes to speak briefly about the actual ownership status of my land. Commissioners grew visibly tired of the back and forth, one privately telling me, "Just get us solid documentation and this stalls itself out." Ruth compiled everything methodically: the rejected 1978 easement request, the forged-looking photocopy Karen's attorney had sent, the shell company funding, the emails about framing, and the trail camera footage. Piece by piece, it stopped looking like a farmer's paranoia and started looking like a paper trail of fraud. Still, paperwork moved slowly, and Karen wasn't waiting around. She began appearing at community events, at the farmers market, even church potlucks, subtly steering conversations toward that difficult farmer resisting a project for the kids and their dogs. Reputation, I realized, was her real weapon. A few longtime friends started asking me carefully worded questions, clearly having absorbed some version of Karen's narrative. I didn't blame them. She was persuasive, likable in short doses, and utterly convincing when she wanted to be. It reminded me why she'd won her HOA election unopposed. Carol, ever practical, suggested we counter quietly rather than loudly, writing a simple, factual letter to the local paper laying out the actual history of the land, the denied easement, and our family's decades of stewardship, without ever mentioning Karen by name or accusation. The letter ran the following Sunday. It didn't attack anyone. 60 years of farming, a denied 1978 easement, an unsolicited proposal on private land. Neighbors who read it started seeing the situation differently, without Karen's narrative filling every gap. Karen's response was a lengthier letter of her own, dismissing our account as one-sided and reaffirming the community's right to grow together. Reading it, Ruth noted something interesting. Karen never actually disputed a single fact we'd stated. She simply talked around them. "That's a tell," Ruth said. "When someone answers accusations with vibes instead of facts, it usually means the facts aren't on their side." I started to believe, for the first time, that this fight might actually be winnable, not through anger, but through patience and documentation. The tide, slowly, began to turn. At the next HOA meeting, attendance was unusually high, word having spread about the dueling newspaper letters. Karen tried to keep the meeting focused on unrelated business, but Frank Ostrowski raised his hand almost immediately asking for a vote on the dog park status. Karen hesitated, clearly not having expected a direct vote to be forced so soon. The board hasn't finalized a recommendation, she said. Frank pressed further. They stand. In plain terms, no renderings. A murmur of agreement passed through the room. For the first time, Karen was forced to admit publicly that no easement had been confirmed by the county, that the property owner had not consented, and that legal costs so far exceeded $3,000 pulled from association reserves without a formal budget vote. A retired accountant named Loretta Kim asked pointedly why reserve funds meant for pool maintenance and landscaping had been redirected toward legal fees on a project that hadn't even been approved. Karen's explanation, something about necessary due diligence, satisfied almost no one in the room. The meeting ended with a motion, seconded quickly, to require any further legal spending on the dog park proposal to go through a full resident vote. Passed almost unanimously. Karen abstained, her expression unreadable, though her grip on the gavel looked tighter than usual. Walking to my truck afterward, Marion caught up with me. "I think people are finally seeing it," she said. "Not because you convinced them with anger, but because you just kept telling the truth and letting her talk herself into corners." I hoped she was right. That should have been the moment Karen backed down. Instead, it seemed to be the moment she decided subtlety wasn't working anymore. Within a week, county code enforcement arrived at my farm unannounced, responding to an anonymous complaint about improper storage of agricultural chemicals near a water source. The inspector, a reasonable man named Curtis Boone, walked the property with me, found my fertilizer and pesticide storage fully compliant, properly labeled, and nowhere near the small creek that ran along my property's eastern edge. He apologized for the visit, noting the complaint had been oddly specific. "Whoever filed this knew exactly where your storage shed was," Curtis said. "Down to the distance from the creek. That's not a random neighbor guessing. That's someone who's been on your property or seen detailed plans of it." I thanked him and said nothing else, though I had a guess. Ruth wasn't surprised when I told her. "Escalating false complaints is a classic pressure tactic," she said. "Each one alone looks minor, deniable. Together, they're a pattern of harassment." She began keeping a formal log, dated and documented, of every incident since the fence cutting. 2 nights later, my trail camera caught something more damning. A figure parking the same unfamiliar car from months earlier, walking directly toward my chemical storage shed with what looked like a phone raised, taking photos, presumably to manufacture evidence for another complaint before I even filed one. This time, the footage was clearer, close enough to make out a jacket I recognized instantly, the same one Karen wore to nearly every HOA meeting. Distinctive purple with an embroidered garden club emblem on the sleeve. My stomach turned. This was proof. Ruth advised extreme caution before going public. "One video isn't a face," she said. "We need corroboration. Something that ties this directly to her, not just a similar jacket." Frustrated but trusting her judgment, I agreed to wait, continuing to monitor and document rather than confront. The break came from an unlikely source. Loretta Kim, the retired accountant who'd questioned the legal spending, approached me quietly at the feed store, saying she'd noticed unusual patterns in the HOA's financial software login history, including late-night access from Karen's account on nights matching my incident log. "Loretta," still technically on the HOA's finance committee, had access to system logs for auditing purposes. She wasn't accusing anyone outright, she said, but the coincidence bothered her enough to mention it. I asked if she'd be willing to share that information with Ruth. Formally, she agreed, cautiously, saying she'd wanted an excuse to look closer at the books for a while anyway, given how quickly legal fees had ballooned without proper board approval. What she found next went far beyond login timestamps, and far beyond anything I'd expected. Buried in vendor payment records, Loretta found a series of landscaping consultation invoices paid to Voss Land Partners, Roy's firm, totaling nearly $11,000 over 8 months, none of which matched any actual landscaping work performed anywhere in Meadow Ridge Estates. Ruth cross-referenced the invoice dates with the zoning overlay meetings Roy had pushed at the county level. The timing lined up almost perfectly, HOA funds flowing to Roy's firm right around key procedural votes, suggesting Karen may have been funneling association money to support her husband's rezoning strategy. If that's what this looks like, Ruth said carefully, that's not just an ethics violation. Depending on how the funds were characterized, that could rise to embezzlement or fraud, especially if she authorized payments without board knowledge or consent. The stakes had just changed entirely. Loretta, visibly shaken by her own discovery, said she felt obligated to bring it to the full board, not just quietly hand it to me. Ruth agreed that was the right move, both ethically and strategically. Let the HOA's own members expose this, she said. It hits harder that way. Loretta requested a special finance committee session, citing budget irregularities without tipping her hand fully in advance. Karen, perhaps sensing nothing yet, approved the meeting without objection, likely assuming it concerned nothing more than routine reserve fund questions from an overly cautious former accountant. The night before that meeting, I barely slept, running through every possible way Karen might spin the numbers, deflect, or delay. Carol reminded me this wasn't my meeting to win or lose. Let Loretta and the board handle their own house, she said. Your job is just to keep telling the truth. The finance committee meeting drew a smaller crowd than the general sessions. Just 5 board members, Loretta, and 2 other residents who'd asked to observe. Karen arrived confident, as always, clipboard in hand, clearly expecting another routine discussion she could steer with practiced ease. Loretta didn't waste time with preamble. She projected the vendor payment log onto the screen, highlighting the Voss Land Partners entries in red. Can someone explain what landscaping work was performed for these payments? She asked. The room went silent. Karen's confident posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Those were consulting fees, Karen said quickly, related to community planning initiatives, properly within board discretion. One board member, a quiet man named Victor Nguyen, asked why community planning fell under a landscaping budget line rather than legal or administrative categories. Karen had no clean answer. Loretta pressed further, pulling up the login timestamps showing Karen accessing the financial system late at night, often around the same dates as suspicious incidents on my property. The fence cutting, the false chemical complaint. She didn't accuse directly, simply laid the dates side by side. Karen's composure cracked slightly for the first time in front of her own board. I don't see how my login times are relevant to a budget discussion, she snapped, an edge creeping into her voice that hadn't been there in any public meeting before that moment. Victor, calm but firm, said the board would need to review all vendor payments to Voss Land Partners independently, given the obvious conflict of interest with Karen's husband's firm. He moved to suspend Karen's financial authorization privileges pending review. The motion passed, 4-1, Karen voting no. Walking out, Karen caught my eye across the parking lot one more time. This time, there was no calculation in her expression, just something closer to panic, quickly masked. I didn't feel triumphant watching it. I just felt, finally, like the truth was catching up to her. News of the suspended financial privileges spread through Meadow Ridge within a day, despite no official statement from the board. Neighbors who'd once trusted Karen's every word began quietly comparing notes, and several, including Marion, told me they'd started keeping their own records of interactions with her. Karen tried to control the narrative at the next general meeting, framing the financial review as a routine audit blown out of proportion by disgruntled board members. Frank Ostrowski, uncharacteristically sharp, asked if routine audits usually involved suspending the president's own account access. Karen didn't answer directly. Ruth, watching this all unfold from a legal strategist's distance, told me it was important not to gloat or overreach. Let the HOA's internal process run its course, she said. Meanwhile, we keep building the county-level case, since that's ultimately what protects your land regardless of HOA politics. True to her word, Ruth filed a formal request with the county prosecutor's office, outlining potential fraud in the vendor payments and the forged easement document, asking for a preliminary review. It wasn't a lawsuit yet, just a request for official eyes on what we'd uncovered. While that request moved through bureaucratic channels, Karen shifted tactics again, this time targeting Loretta directly, filing an HOA complaint accusing her of unauthorized access to confidential financial systems, despite Loretta's official role on the finance committee giving her explicit access rights. The complaint felt desperate, even to residents who'd previously trusted Karen without question. Loretta, unbothered, simply provided her committee appointment paperwork showing full system access authorization dated 8 months earlier, well before any of this began. The complaint was dismissed within days. Karen's credibility, once nearly untouchable in Meadow Ridge, was eroding visibly with each miscalculated move. Still, she wasn't finished. Pete called me one evening, voice tight, saying he'd heard through a broker contact that Roy Voss had quietly submitted an offer on the Hendricks farm to the west. That was the same property Pete had mentioned months earlier, bordering the county access road Meadow Ridge relied on for its secondary entrance. If Roy secured it, along with any future claim on part of my land, he'd control a critical stretch of access infrastructure near the subdivision. Ruth's eyes lit up when I told her. That changes the calculus significantly, she said. If they're this determined to control access and land near Meadow Ridge, there might be a way to use that determination against them, rather than just defending against it reactively. I asked her to explain. She laid it out carefully, on controlling specific access points and adjoining acreage. Then someone else legally acquiring key surrounding parcels first could block those plans entirely, without ever needing a courtroom, simply through ordinary, lawful property ownership and access rights. It was the first time since this all began that I felt something other than defense might be possible. I called Pete immediately, asking what he knew about both the Hendricks farm and the old Callahan tract to the north, both mentioned months earlier as quietly listed. Pete confirmed both were still available. The Hendricks family eager to retire to Florida. The Callahan estate handled by an out-of-state heir who mostly wanted a quick, fair sale. Neither had accepted Roy's offer yet, though Pete warned the Hendricks were leaning toward accepting soon. That night, Carol and I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator, our savings account statement, and a legal pad, running numbers we'd never seriously considered before, buying not just our own land's protection, but the ground around it that Karen and Roy needed for their plans. It was a bigger risk than anything we'd taken in 20 years of marriage. Stretching savings, taking on debt, betting on land instead of sitting back and hoping the legal process alone would protect us. But something in me had shifted. I was done just reacting. Ruth cautioned patience once more, this time on the acquisition side. Move quietly, she said. If Karen or Roy realize what you're doing before it's finalized, they'll either outbid you or find another route entirely. I nodded, understanding for the first time that timing mattered as much as truth. Pete agreed to broker both deals personally, keeping my name off initial paperwork by routing offers through a small holding entity Ruth helped set up, Whitaker Family Holdings LLC, structured cleanly and legally, simply to avoid tipping our hand before contracts were signed and recorded. Negotiations with the Hendricks family moved quickly once they realized a serious, fair, all-cash offer was on the table. No financing contingencies, no drawn-out closing timeline. They accepted within a week. Relieved, Pete said, to be free of the pressure Roy's team had been quietly applying. The Callahan tract took longer. The out-of-state heir cautious after receiving competing offers. But Ruth helped structure terms that addressed the heir's main concern. A fast, clean closing without complications. By early the following month, both parcels were under contract, pending final title work. Meanwhile, Karen, unaware of what was happening 2 farms over, continued pushing her dog park narrative publicly, seemingly determined to force a resolution before her credibility eroded further. She scheduled a special HOA vote, bypassing the board's earlier requirement, claiming emergency community interest justified skipping normal procedure. Ruth flagged this immediately as a potential bylaws violation, since Meadow Ridge's governing documents required board approval, not just presidential discretion, for special votes involving expenditures over a certain threshold. Karen, was gambling everything on pushing the vote through before anyone could stop her. The night before the scheduled vote, Ruth and I reviewed everything one final time. The denied 1978 easement, the forged photocopy, the funneled payments to Voss land partners, the trail camera footage, and now, quietly finalized, 2 land purchases that would soon change the entire equation. I hadn't planned to reveal the land purchases publicly yet, wanting closings fully finalized first. But watching Karen's special vote notice sitting on my kitchen table, I felt something harden in me. She wasn't going to stop pushing until every door was closed in front of her. The morning of the special vote, both the Hendricks and Callahan closings were confirmed complete, recorded with the county, entirely legal, entirely mine. Whitaker Family Holdings LLC now owned not just my original 60 acres, but the surrounding parcels controlling the only viable access routes near them. Ruth reviewed the final title documents with obvious satisfaction. "This isn't just protective anymore," she said. Depending on how Meadow Ridge's secondary entrance easement was originally structured, you may now control legal access rights that the subdivision itself depends on for that side of the development. I hadn't fully grasped the implications until Ruth explained further. The Hendricks parcel included a recorded access easement that Meadow Ridge's original developer had used, informally, as an unofficial secondary route for construction vehicles, one that had never been permanently secured in writing by the HOA itself. If that access was never formalized, Ruth said, and the land is now yours, you have every legal right to restrict or close it entirely. It wouldn't affect the subdivision's primary entrance, but it would eliminate any informal shortcut Roy's firm has been quietly relying on. That evening, I drove to the special HOA meeting with Ruth beside me, folder of documents in hand, feeling something closer to steady resolve than anger for the first time in months. Karen stood at the podium as residents filed in, clearly sensing momentum was finally, fully hers again. She opened with confidence, describing the dog park as long overdue and urging residents to finally move forward together as a community. Several longtime supporters nodded along, though the room felt thinner on enthusiasm than her earlier presentations, word of the Finance Committee findings having spread widely by now. When she opened the floor for comments before the vote, I stood, folder in hand. Before anyone votes, I said, there's new information relevant to this proposal that the board and residents should hear. Karen's expression flickered, uncertain, but she gestured for me to continue, unable to refuse publicly. I laid it out plainly. No theatrics, just facts. The 1978 easement Karen had cited was, according to county records, formally denied that same year, never approved. The photocopy submitted as evidence didn't match any authentic filing format used by the county at that time. Gasps rippled through the room, quiet but unmistakable. I continued, describing the vendor payments to Voss Land Partners, the timing alongside key zoning votes, and the ongoing county prosecutor review Ruth had initiated weeks earlier. Karen's hands gripped the podium's edges, knuckles pale under the fluorescent lights. Then came the part one hadn't planned to say aloud yet, but felt, in that moment, needed saying. As of this morning, I said, my family has legally acquired the Hendricks and Callahan properties bordering the subdivision's secondary access route. The room went completely silent. That access route, I continued, was never formally secured by this HOA in writing. It's now part of privately held land my family controls. Effective immediately, we're closing that access, entirely within our legal rights. Someone near the back audibly whispered, "Oh my God!" Karen's composure, the same composure she'd worn through every meeting, every letter, every carefully worded denial, finally, visibly broke. You can't do that, she said, voice sharp, almost pleading. That access is essential for construction vehicles, for emergency routes, for, she stopped herself too late. Frank Ostrowski raised his hand slowly. Emergency routes for what? Exactly, Karen? This neighborhood has a fully functional primary entrance. Unless there's something about future development plans this board hasn't been told about. The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed and impossible to deflect. Karen didn't answer immediately. Roy, sitting in the second row, shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the residents around him. It was the first time I'd seen him at a meeting where his presence wasn't just supportive spectatorship, but something closer to visible, cornered anxiety. Ruth stood, calm and measured. "I'd also like to note," she said, "that the county prosecutor's office has an open inquiry into potential fraudulent documentation and misuse of association funds connected to this dog park proposal. Any vote tonight should be made with that fully in mind." The board members exchanged glances, several clearly recalculating everything they thought they understood about the past several months. Victor Nguyen, calm but firm, motioned to indefinitely table the dog park vote pending the outcome of the county investigation. Passed unanimously, Karen included, visibly outmaneuvered. The meeting didn't end there, though the vote itself had. Residents stayed, murmuring, some approaching me directly with apologies for doubting my earlier account, others simply staring at Karen with the kind of realization that comes slowly, then all at once. Once deception finally surfaces. Marion found me near the exit, eyes wet. "I should have trusted my instincts sooner," she said. "You were never the problem here." I told her not to apologize, that Karen was good at what she did, convincing people of things that weren't true, until they weren't anymore. Driving home that night, Carol met me at the door before I even made it up the porch steps, having heard secondhand already from a neighbor's phone call. "You actually did it," she said, half laughing, half in disbelief. For the first time in months, I let myself smile fully. The following days brought a strange quiet to Meadow Ridge, the kind that settles after a storm everyone saw coming but nobody wanted to admit was real. Karen didn't attend the next scheduled HOA meeting, citing a family matter, her first absence since taking office 2 years earlier. In her absence, Victor Nguyen, appointed interim president by board vote, addressed residents directly, confirming the county prosecutor's office had formally opened an investigation into potential document fraud and financial misconduct connected to the dog park proposal and associated vendor payments to Voss Land Partners. Loretta's financial records, combined with Ruth's documentation of the forged easement and my trail camera footage, had given investigators more than enough to proceed. Deputy Ruiz's earlier trespassing report, once seemingly minor, now fit neatly into a pattern investigators described as deliberate and sustained. Within 2 weeks, the county prosecutor's office issued subpoenas for Karen's and Roy's financial and communication records, including the emails Ruth had obtained showing the dog park framing strategy discussed months before any public proposal. The scale of what they'd built began unraveling quickly. Roy's county council seat, already a subject of scrutiny given his firm's involvement, faced mounting pressure from fellow commissioners uncomfortable with the appearance of using public office to benefit private zoning interests. He announced his resignation for personal reasons less than a month later. Karen, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning within Meadow Ridge. A resident-led petition, organized quietly by Frank and Marion, gathered signatures for a formal recall vote, citing breach of fiduciary duty, misuse of association funds, and conduct unbecoming an HOA officer under the governing bylaws. The recall vote, when it finally happened, wasn't close. Of the residents who cast ballots, the overwhelming majority favored removing Karen from the board entirely, not just the presidency. Even some of her earliest, most loyal supporters quietly acknowledged they could no longer defend her actions. I didn't attend that particular meeting, feeling it was, finally, something Meadow Ridge needed to resolve as a community, without my presence looming over it. Ruth called that evening with the results anyway. "It's done," she said simply. "She's out. Effective immediately. Full board vote." The county's investigation, running parallel to the HOA's internal process, moved steadily forward over the following weeks. Investigators confirmed the 1978 easement photocopy had been digitally altered, the notary stamp lifted and pasted from an unrelated document, the signature traced rather than authentic. They also confirmed the anonymous chemical storage complaint against me had originated from an IP address registered to Karen's home internet account, matching the timestamp precisely with the trail camera footage of her jacket near my shed. Deniability, once her greatest tool, had finally run out. Karen was formally charged with several counts, including document forgery, filing a false report, and misappropriation of association funds. Roy faced separate scrutiny for the shell company payments and potential conflict of interest violations tied to his council votes on the zoning overlay he championed. News of the charges spread beyond Meadow Ridge, picked up by the local paper that had once printed our dueling letters. This time, there was no ambiguity in the coverage, just a straightforward account of forged documents, misused funds, and a farmer who'd simply refused to back down. I found myself, oddly, not gloating the way I once imagined I might, back when this all started with a letter taped to my mailbox. Mostly, I just felt tired and relieved and eager to get back to a life that wasn't dominated by meetings and letters. Carol reminded me gently that relief didn't mean forgetting. "You built something real here," she said. "Not just winning a fight, but protecting what your grandfather started." She was right. The land, still standing, still mine, mattered more than any satisfaction I felt watching Karen's downfall. In the weeks that followed, I finally addressed the fence, the same section cut all those months ago, reinforcing it properly with Emma's help during her spring break from vet school. She'd followed the whole ordeal from a distance. "Proud," she said, "of how we'd handled it." "You didn't just fight back," Emma said, tightening a wire brace beside me. "You built something bigger than the fight itself." I hadn't thought of it that way until she said it, but she wasn't wrong. Owning the surrounding land meant protecting more than just this dispute. Pete, ever the businessman, half-joked that Whitaker Family Holdings LLC had accidentally become the most strategically located property owner near Meadow Ridge, controlling access, buffer land, and future negotiating leverage for anything the subdivision might ever want to expand toward again. I told him that was fine by me. Ruth, wrapping up her formal involvement, sent one final letter confirming all county filings were clean, the disputed easement claim permanently dismissed, and the acquired parcels fully, legally secured under our name. "You didn't just win this," she wrote.
"You made sure it..."
At the next General Meadow Ridge meeting, now under Victor's steady leadership, the board formally issued a written apology to me and to Loretta, acknowledging the harm caused by unverified accusations and unauthorized use of association resources. It wasn't required, but it mattered, more than I expected. Several residents approached afterward, some sheepish, some openly grateful, thanking me for holding firm even when public opinion had briefly turned against me. Frank shook my hand firmly. "Neighbors like you are why this place is worth living in," he said. I appreciated it more than I let on. Marion mentioned she'd started attending every meeting since, no longer content to sit quietly in the back. "I learned something from watching you," she said. "Sometimes the truth needs someone patient enough to let it surface on its own, instead of shouting it before anyone's ready to hear it." The dog park proposal itself quietly died. Never formally voted down. Simply abandoned. Its renderings and paperwork archived somewhere in the HOA's old meeting minutes. Ironically, Victor mentioned the board was now discussing a small community garden instead, on actual HOA-owned common land. No disputes involved. Karen's criminal case moved slowly through the county court system over the following months. Ruth kept me updated periodically, though I found myself less consumed by the details than I expected. Life's ordinary rhythms. Planting season. Cattle checks. Emma's coursework. Gradually reclaiming the space Karen's scheme had occupied. Roy's business. Voss Land Partners. Quietly dissolved amid the fallout. Its remaining projects, including the Meadow Ridge zoning overlay, formally withdrawn from county consideration. The overlay's withdrawal meant no future HOA could easily attempt what Karen had tried, at least not through that particular loophole. I later learned, through Pete, that the Voss family had listed their own Meadow Ridge house for sale, moving away entirely before Karen's case concluded. The community's opinion of her having shifted too thoroughly for any comfortable return to normal life among the neighbors she'd once led. Their departure felt, to me, less like victory and more like the natural conclusion of a story that had simply run its course. Deception unable to sustain itself forever against patient, documented truth. Still, driving past their empty house sometimes, I felt an odd mix of relief and sadness. Carol reminded me that sadness wasn't weakness. You can be glad it's over and still recognize 2 lives got wrecked by their own choices, she said. That doesn't make you soft. It makes you the kind of person who never needed to destroy someone to protect what's yours. By late summer, the county formally closed its investigation into the falsified easement, confirming publicly what Ruth had proven months earlier, that no legitimate access right had ever existed over my land. The finding was recorded permanently, ensuring no future HOA or developer could resurrect the same false claim. Karen ultimately accepted a plea agreement, avoiding trial, pleading guilty to reduced charges of falsifying records and misuse of association funds, receiving probation, restitution obligations to Meadow Ridge's HOA, and a formal prohibition from serving on any homeowners association board within the state for 10 years. Roy faced a separate ethics inquiry through the county council, ultimately resulting in a formal censure and repayment of consulting fees tied to conflicts of interest, though prosecutors determined his direct legal exposure, absent Karen's forged documents, didn't rise to the same criminal threshold she'd crossed. I attended the final restitution hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because Ruth felt my presence, calm and simply present, mattered for the record. Karen didn't look at me once during the proceeding, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something smaller, quieter, thoroughly diminished. Afterward, in the courthouse parking lot, I ran into her unexpectedly, both of us walking toward our cars at the same time. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, quietly, "I never actually hated your farm, you know. I just wanted more than what I had." I didn't respond with anger, though I'd imagined this moment countless times over the past year. Instead, I just said, "You could have asked." Honestly, instead of taking. Most people around here would have helped you build something real, if you'd ever just been straight about what you wanted. She didn't answer, just nodded slightly, got into her car, and drove away. I stood there a moment longer, watching her taillights disappear down the road, feeling, finally, like the weight I'd carried since that first letter on my mailbox had genuinely, completely lifted off my shoulders. That evening, I walked the fence line alone, Scout trotting ahead through the tall grass, the same stretch where the cuts had happened, where the false sign once stood, where trail cameras had captured proof nobody wanted to believe until the evidence became undeniable. Everything was quiet now. Carol met me halfway across the field, carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea, and we sat on the old wooden fence post together, watching the sun drop behind the tree line, cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. No cut wires, no strange cars, no manufactured crises waiting in the shadows. "Feels different now," she said. I agreed. It had changed. 60 acres. Same soil. Same fence lines my grandfather had walked decades earlier. But because the fight to protect it had, strangely, made it feel even more permanently, undeniably ours than it had before. In the following weeks, Whitaker Family Holdings LLC formally merged the Hendricks and Callahan parcels into the working farm, expanding grazing land modestly, though the real value, as Ruth had predicted, lay less in acreage and more in the quiet, permanent security of controlling our own boundaries. Emma, finishing her final year of vet school, mentioned she'd started researching agricultural law alongside her veterinary studies. Inspired, she said, by watching Ruth work. "Never thought I'd want to understand easements and zoning," she laughed. "But I guess this year changed a few things for all of us." Pete, meanwhile, found himself fielding inquiries from other local farmers who'd heard about the situation, wanting advice on protecting their own land from similar HOA overreach as new developments continued creeping outward from town. He half-joked about starting a side consulting business just for that purpose. Ruth, invited to speak at a county agricultural association meeting that fall, used our case, with my permission, as a cautionary example, emphasizing documentation, patience, and the importance of never assuming good faith from parties who'd already demonstrated a willingness to bend or forge the truth. Victor, still leading Meadow Ridge's board, implemented new bylaws requiring any proposal involving neighboring property to include verified documentation, and direct owner consultation before any presentation to residents, a policy several nearby HOAs later adopted after hearing how the situation had unfolded. Frank and Marion started an informal neighborhood tradition, an annual fall gathering at the fence line between Meadow Ridge and my property, inviting residents and my family together, a small, deliberate gesture to rebuild the kind of trust Karen's scheme had nearly destroyed between 2 adjoining communities. The first gathering felt awkward. Understandably, some residents still carrying quiet embarrassment over how easily they'd once believed Karen's version of events. But by the second year, it had become something genuinely warm. Kids from Meadow Ridge petting Scout, neighbors admiring the cattle, real conversations replacing old suspicion. I never did build a dog park on that land, though, almost as a private joke. Carol and I fenced off a small corner near the new property line the following spring. Just enough space for Scout and a couple of neighborhood dogs to run freely during visits. Marion laughed the first time she saw it. "So there's finally a dog park," she said. "Just not the one anybody fought over." I told her that felt about right. Something built out of genuine goodwill instead of manipulation. Small, unofficial, and entirely, quietly mine to give freely. Looking back, I've thought often about the moment this all truly turned. Not the dramatic reveal at the special meeting, but earlier, quieter, when Loretta first noticed strange login timestamps and decided, on her own conscience, that the truth mattered more than comfortable silence. Ruth once told me that most schemes like Karen's don't unravel because of one dramatic confrontation, but because enough ordinary people, a records clerk, a finance volunteer, a deputy willing to file an honest report, simply refused to look away from small inconsistencies that didn't add up. I think about Karen sometimes, not with anger anymore, mostly just a kind of tired understanding. She wanted control, status, maybe more than her own life had given her elsewhere, and she chased it by taking from people who'd never done anything except quietly build something real. Roy, from what Pete heard through old real estate contacts, eventually relocated out of state, starting some new consulting venture 2 counties over. I don't know if he learned anything from what happened here. I stopped wondering about that particular question a while ago. Honestly, what I do know is this: 60 acres became roughly 90, not through some grand ambition of expansion, but through patient, deliberate protection of what mattered, met with equally deliberate deception from someone who assumed persistence and confidence alone would eventually wear an honest person down. Didn't. Fearless. There were plenty of nights I lay awake certain we'd lose everything to legal fees and false accusations. But because Carol, Ruth, Pete, Loretta, Marion, Frank, and eventually the whole quiet weight of documented truth, simply outlasted every lie stacked against us. The following spring, planting season arrived the way it always had. Early mornings, cold coffee, dirt under my fingernails by sunrise. Scout ran the new fence lines each morning, familiar now with boundaries that had once been contested ground. Simply home again, the way land is supposed to feel. Carol started teaching a unit in her 3rd grade class. Loosely, carefully framed for young students, about property rights and honesty, using, she admitted with a laugh, our own story as an unspoken example without ever naming names. Kids should understand standing up for the truth takes patience, she said. Emma graduated vet school that following year, accepting a position at a rural practice not far from home, close enough to help with the cattle on weekends, close enough that Sunday dinners returned to something like their old, familiar rhythm, before letters and lawsuits interrupted everything. Ruth, still practicing land use law locally, occasionally sends updates about other farmers facing similar HOA pressures nearby, sometimes asking permission to reference our case as precedent, sometimes just checking in. Each time, I'm reminded how close we came to losing something that never should have been threatened. Pete's informal advising business for local farmers slowly grew into something more structured, eventually partnering formally with Ruth's practice to offer land use consultations specifically for agricultural families facing encroaching development. He jokes it's the most useful thing to come out of Karen's whole mess, as he calls it. Meadow Ridge itself settled into a quieter, steadier rhythm under Victor's continued leadership, The fall gathering at the fence line becoming an established tradition, drawing larger crowds each year. A strange but genuine legacy born from a conflict nobody there particularly wanted to remember in detail anymore. I still walk the fence line most mornings, coffee in hand, Scout ahead of me, checking the same wire that was once cut in 3 deliberate places. It holds fine now, has for years. A small, ordinary detail that somehow still feels like quiet proof of everything we protected. Sometimes newer Meadow Ridge residents, unaware of the history, ask casually about the old dog park sign story they've heard secondhand, half legend by now among neighbors. I usually just smile and tell them the short version. A farmer, some paperwork, and neighbors who eventually chose truth over comfort. The full story, the forged easement, the shell company, the fence cuttings, the trail camera footage, the careful land purchases that closed off every angle Karen and Roy had built, stays mostly between those of us who lived through each turn of it. Documented, settled, and finally, quietly closed. Karen's 10-year prohibition from HOA board service will expire eventually, long after most current Meadow Ridge residents have likely moved on themselves, replaced by new families who'll never know her name unless someone tells them. I've made peace with that. This one, mostly, has. What remains, permanently, is simpler than anything Karen ever tried to build. 90 acres, clean title, honest boundaries, a family that held together under pressure instead of breaking, and neighbors who, eventually, chose to see clearly rather than comfortably. That, more than any courtroom outcome, feels like the real ending. Carol and I still sit on that same fence post some evenings, sweet tea in hand, watching cattle graze where a dog park sign once stood uninvited. Scout usually finds his way to that same patch of ground too, circling twice before lying down, entirely unaware he was ever the subject of a scheme. I think, sometimes, about what would have happened if I'd simply given in early on, signed some vague conservation easement just to make the letters and pressure stop. Ruth once told me most people do exactly that, worn down not by strong arguments, but by sheer persistent exhaustion. I understand that impulse completely now, having lived through months of manufactured crises designed specifically to produce it. What saved us wasn't stubbornness alone. It was patient people around me, Ruth's careful documentation, Loretta's quiet conscience, Carol's steady presence, refusing to let exhaustion decide the outcome instead of truth. Frank still greets me at the fall gathering each year with the same handshake and the same line. Neighbors like you are why this place is worth living in. And each year it means a little more, layered now with everything that's happened since he first said it. Marion, still active on the HOA board herself these days, occasionally mentions new residents proposing ambitious community projects. And she laughs, saying she now always asks one simple question first. Has the actual landowner agreed to this? A small, permanent habit born directly from watching Karen's scheme unravel. Victor, still leading Meadow Ridge years later, credits that entire period with fundamentally changing how the association operates. More transparency, stricter financial oversight, mandatory documentation for any proposal touching outside property. We learned the hard way, he told me once. But we did learn. Loretta retired fully from the finance committee eventually, though she still stops by occasionally during harvest season, saying she likes seeing tangible proof that her late-night spreadsheet suspicions actually mattered for something real. I always make sure she leaves with a bag of sweet corn each visit. Deputy Ruiz, promoted to sergeant a couple years later, still patrols the same rural roads, occasionally waving as he passes the farm. He mentioned once, offhandedly, that our case became something of a quiet training example for newer deputies about taking seemingly minor property complaints seriously from the start. Ruth's firm grew steadily over the following years. Her reputation strengthened locally by cases like ours, farmers and small landowners increasingly seeking her out specifically for HOA and zoning disputes. She jokes sometimes that Karen, entirely unintentionally, became one of her best sources of referral business. Emma, now fully established at the rural veterinary practice, occasionally treats dogs belonging to Meadow Ridge families, including, once, unexpectedly, a golden retriever belonging to a family who'd bought the old Voss house after Karen and Roy moved away. Small, strange threads connecting an ordinary present to an extraordinary past. Pete still tells the story at family gatherings sometimes, embellishing slightly more each year, though Carol always gently corrects the exaggerated parts, insisting the truth was dramatic enough on its own without needing extra flourish. Emma usually just laughs, having heard both versions dozens of times by now. I've never felt the need to dramatize any of it myself. The plain facts always seemed sufficient. An HOA president who mistook confidence and persistence for entitlement. A family who simply refused to let go of something honestly earned. And a community that eventually, imperfectly, chose truth over comfort. Some nights, walking the property alone after chores, I still catch myself glancing toward the spot where that first letter waited on my mailbox. Folded neatly, deceptively ordinary looking. It's strange how something so small, so quietly presumptuous, ended up reshaping so much of our lives. Carol says she still remembers the exact moment I walked into the kitchen holding that letter. Confused rather than angry at first. Genuinely unable to understand why anyone would propose building on land they didn't own. You looked more puzzled than upset, she recalls. That came later. Looking back, I think that initial confusion mattered more than I realized at the time. It meant I approached everything that followed methodically, documenting rather than reacting purely on anger, which Ruth later told me made an enormous difference in how credible our case appeared throughout the entire process. Karen, I later heard through distant, second-hand channels, eventually found steady work again in another state, something unrelated to real estate or community associations entirely. I hope, genuinely, she found some version of peace, even if it came through a much harder, more humbling path than she'd expected. Roy, similarly, faded from local relevance entirely, his name occasionally surfacing in unrelated business filings 2 counties over. Never again involved in anything touching Meadow Ridge or the surrounding farmland he'd once quietly maneuvered to control. Some names, eventually, just stop mattering to the people they once affected. What stayed, what mattered, was simpler and far more durable than any scheme built on forged documents and manufactured urgency. 90 acres of honest ground, a fence line that holds, a family that grew closer rather than apart under pressure, and neighbors who chose, eventually, to see clearly. The final HOA meeting I attended as an occasional guest, years after everything settled, involved something almost comically ordinary compared to everything before. a debate about mailbox paint colors. I sat in the back, smiling privately, grateful beyond words for how blessedly boring that particular disagreement was. Frank caught my eye across the room and grinned, clearly thinking the same thing. Afterward, walking to our trucks together, he said, "Never thought I'd miss the drama enough to almost laugh about mailbox colors. But here we are." I told him boring was underrated. Deeply, genuinely underrated. Marian, overhearing, added her own thought as we reached the parking lot. "Boring means safe," she said. "Means nobody's trying to take something that isn't theirs." I nodded, thinking of the fence line, the trail cameras long since removed, the quiet mornings that had finally, fully returned. Carol, waiting at home that evening, asked how the meeting went. "Mailbox colors," I said, and she laughed harder than she had in months. The kind of laugh that comes easily only once real fear has genuinely, permanently passed. We sat on the porch a long while after that. Emma, visiting that weekend, asked if I ever regretted how much time and money the whole ordeal had cost us. Legal fees, the land purchases, the sleepless nights. I told her honestly, no, not once, because what we'd protected was never really just land. It was the principle underneath it. Somebody has to be willing to hold the line, I told her, even when it's easier, cheaper, and less exhausting just to give in. Emma nodded slowly, and I could see, in that moment, some version of the same steady resolve Carol and I had carried finally settling into her too. Ruth, retiring eventually from active practice years later, mentioned our case specifically in a small local newspaper feature about her career, describing it simply as a reminder that documentation and patience beat intimidation nearly every time, provided someone's willing to outlast the pressure instead of folding under it. I keep that clipping folded inside the same fireproof box where my original deed sits, alongside the survey, the county's formal easement denial letter, and, oddly sentimental as it feels, the very first HOA letter Karen ever sent. The one that started everything, kept simply as a quiet reminder. Scout, older now, slower on his morning walks along the fence, still insists on the same route every day. Past the spot where the false sign once stood, now just ordinary pasture again. Cattle grazing peacefully. No trace remaining of anything Karen and Roy had once planned there. Carol and I talk sometimes about eventually passing the farm to Emma. Whenever she's ready, 90 acres now instead of 60, boundaries secured not through inheritance alone but through a hard one, thoroughly documented fight neither of us ever expected to face when we first started this life together. "She'll know exactly what this land cost us to protect," Carol said recently, watching Emma help move cattle during a weekend visit. "Not in money, though there was plenty of that too, but in patience, in trust, in refusing to let someone else's ambition define what belonged to us." I think often about Loretta's quiet moment of conscience, checking timestamps she didn't have to check, and how something so small, so easily overlooked, became the thread that eventually unraveled everything Karen had carefully built. Truth, I've learned, rarely announces itself loudly. It waits for someone willing to notice. Marion's fall gatherings at the fence line continue each year, now simply called, by unspoken tradition, Fence Line Day, drawing Meadow Ridge families and our Own together for an afternoon that requires no explanation anymore. Just neighbors sharing food. Kids petting Scout's successor. An easy, hard-earned normalcy. Victor. Still occasionally consulting with newer HOA boards in the county. Uses our story, always with permission, as a teaching example. Not to shame anyone, he says, but to illustrate exactly how quickly good intentions can curdle into overreach when unchecked power meets unverified assumptions about someone else's property. I never set out to become an example of anything. I just wanted to keep farming the land my grandfather started. The way he taught my father, the way I've since taught Emma, quietly, patiently, without needing anyone else's permission or approval to justify 60, then 90, honest acres, some nights, standing at the fence line as the sun drops behind familiar tree lines. I think about how close it all came to going differently. One uncut fence wire, one honest deputy, one careful attorney, one quietly suspicious former accountant. Each small thread holding the whole truth together. Karen wanted a dog park that was never really about dogs at all. What she got instead was a truth she couldn't outrun. Forged documents that couldn't survive scrutiny. And a farmer who, rather than folding under pressure, simply bought the ground around every angle she tried to use. The land holds steady now. Has for years. Cattle grazing where confrontation once stood. Fences repaired and reinforced. Boundaries clear and undisputed. Karen and Roy are distant memories to most of Meadow Ridge. Footnotes in a community's history rather than the defining chapter they once tried to author. Carol still keeps that framed newspaper clipping, our original letter to the editor, hanging quietly in the farmhouse hallway, a small, understated reminder that truth, patiently and persistently told, eventually outlasts even the most confident, well-funded deception. I pass it every morning on my way out to the barn. 90 acres. Clean title. Honest neighbors. And a fence line that holds. That's what remains. Long after the letters stopped. Long after the lawsuits settled. Long after Karen's name stopped meaning anything at all around here. Just land. Honestly kept. Exactly the way it was always meant to be.